The rain hammered against the tall glass windows of the Kensington estate like thousands of tiny fists, but inside, silence reigned. The sprawling mansion was immaculate, every corner polished to perfection, except for one room upstairs, where muffled cries echoed through the hall. 8-year-old Ethan sat curled in a corner, his small hands pressed tightly against his ears. The lights were too bright, the thunder too loud, the world too confusing. He rocked back and forth, whispering a song only he understood. His father, Alexander Grant, one of the wealthiest men in the country, stood helpless at the doorway. A man who could command empires with a single signature now watched his son's pain with powerless eyes. "Can't you just calm him down?" he muttered to the butler, frustration breaking through his usually controlled voice. The staff shifted nervously. No one dared step inside. Ethan's meltdowns were unpredictable, and in this household of strict order, there was no place for chaos. Then, from the far end of the hall, Grace, the new maid, appeared, late 20s, modestly dressed, carrying a basket of freshly folded laundry. She had only been hired a week ago. Most staff whispered that she wouldn't last. Alexander barely noticed her, but now something shifted. Grace gently put down the basket and walked toward Ethan. "Don't," the head housekeeper hissed under her breath. "He won't let anyone near him." Grace ignored it. She knelt slowly, not touching him, just humming softly. It wasn't a song anyone recognized, just a warm, steady tune. Ethan's rocking slowed. His sobs softened. She began tapping the floor lightly with her fingers, creating a rhythm. Ethan peeked through his tear-streaked lashes. For the first time in hours, his breathing steadied. From the doorway, Alexander watched, frozen. This woman, a stranger in his house, had done in seconds what expensive therapists, specialists, and even he could not. His chest tightened, a foreign emotion rising. He didn't know it yet, but this moment would change his life forever. Outside, the storm raged on. But inside that small room, something gentle had begun. The next morning, the sun filtered through the enormous glass panels of the Grant estate, illuminating the grand foyer like a cathedral. But inside, warmth was nowhere to be found. Staff members moved briskly, their heads down, their conversations clipped. Grace carried a silver tray toward the dining hall, trying to blend into the rhythm of the house. She'd only been there a week, but every second felt like walking on a tightrope over cold marble floors. At the long dining table sat Alexander Grant, immaculate in his tailored suit, scrolling through emails on his tablet. At the far end, Ethan was picking at his breakfast, humming to himself and arranging blueberries into perfect circles. Grace set down a fresh pot of tea beside Alexander. "Careful with that. Last week, someone spilled it on the table and was gone by noon," the head housekeeper whispered sharply behind her, the words slicing the air. Grace nodded silently. She was used to whispers. Ever since she stepped into this mansion, the other staff had looked at her differently. Maybe it was because she was new, maybe because of her skin, or maybe because she didn't seem to know her place as much as they expected. She wasn't rude, just quiet, observant, focused. But in this house, silence didn't mean safety. As she turned to leave, a sharp voice stopped her. "You," Alexander said without looking up. Grace froze. "Yes, sir? You were the one in Ethan's room last night?" Her heart raced. Had she broken a rule? Yes, he was upset. "I just wanted to help." Alexander looked up for the first time. His blue eyes were cool, analytical, the way a man looks at a quarterly report. "Interesting," he murmured, before going back to his tablet. "Carry on." It was a small moment, but it unsettled the hierarchy of the house. Whispers followed her for the rest of the day. Later, during lunch prep, Grace carried trays to the back garden where Ethan liked to sit. The boy was alone, stacking toy cars in symmetrical lines. She placed his sandwich gently beside him. He didn't speak, but when she started humming that same tune from the stormy night, his shoulders relaxed. He tapped the rhythm on the bench, matching her beat. In the kitchen, 2 maids watched through the window. "She's trying too hard," one muttered. "She won't last." "They never do," the other replied. Grace heard every word. She pretended not to, but the sting was real. She needed this job. It wasn't just about money, it was survival. That night, in the small staff quarters at the edge of the estate, Grace sat on her narrow bed and pulled out an old, Folded photograph, her younger brother David, smiling despite the oxygen tube in his nose. Her chest tightened. His treatments were expensive, and every paycheck she sent home meant the difference between hope and despair. She whispered to herself, "Just a little longer. Stay strong." Her phone buzzed, a text from her mother. "The hospital says we need another payment by Friday. Please, Grace." David's coughing again. She closed her eyes, holding back tears. Outside, the mansion lights glittered like stars. Inside, Grace made a silent promise. No matter how cruel the world inside those walls became, she would endure it for her brother. The next few days blurred into a mix of chores, unspoken tensions, and fleeting moments with Ethan. Grace noticed things others ignored: how Ethan would flinch at sudden footsteps, how he lined up his food before taking a single bite, how he lit up when someone simply respected his patterns instead of interrupting them. Slowly, without forcing, she earned his trust. But not everyone was pleased. One afternoon, Grace entered the music room to find the head housekeeper waiting with crossed arms. "You're spending a lot of time with the boy," she said. Grace hesitated. "He seems comfortable with me." "Just don't get too comfortable. Mr. Grant doesn't keep people around for long. Maids like you come and go. You're not special." The words were like ice water. Grace bit her tongue and nodded. Arguing wouldn't help. What she didn't know was that Alexander had paused outside the door, overhearing everything. For the first time, he felt conflicted. He'd built a fortress of wealth and rules around his life, but something about Grace's quiet persistence unsettled that fortress. And deep inside, a storm was beginning to form. The moment Alexander overheard the housekeeper's cold warning, something shifted inside him. For years, he'd prided himself on running his household like a corporation, efficient, distant, unbothered. But hearing those words, "You're not special," aimed at Grace, the maid who had done what no one else could for his son, left a bitter taste. He didn't step in. He simply stood in the hallway, hands in his pockets, listening. When Grace finally walked out of the music room with lowered eyes, she didn't see him watching. Over the next few days, Alexander began noticing things he'd previously ignored. When he passed by the garden in the mornings, Grace was there, humming softly while Ethan tapped along to her rhythm. When she served meals, Ethan would lean slightly toward her side of the table, his small way of seeking comfort. Even the staff seemed unsettled by this unexpected bond. Whispers trailed behind her everywhere she went. One afternoon during piano practice, Ethan suddenly froze at the sharp sound of a dropped utensil in the kitchen. His breathing quickened. Panic spread across his face. The tutor panicked, calling for assistance. But before anyone else could react, Grace stepped in. She knelt beside Ethan, whispered something gentle, and started the familiar humming. Slowly, Ethan calmed, his hands unclenching as he leaned into her presence. Alexander, standing in the doorway, felt a strange mix of awe and guilt. Why hadn't he ever been able to reach his own son like that? The head housekeeper noticed Alexander's lingering gaze and stiffened. Later that evening, she pulled Grace aside near the servants' corridor. "You're attracting too much attention," she hissed. "This house has rules. Know your place." Grace swallowed hard. "I'm just doing my job. Jobs don't involve getting close to the family. Watch yourself." Those words stayed with her long into the night. In her tiny room, she stared at the photograph of David again. She couldn't afford to lose this job. She whispered a prayer, asking for strength, and promised herself she'd keep her head down, even though her heart wouldn't let her ignore Ethan. Meanwhile, Alexander's curiosity grew. Late one night, while reviewing reports in his study, he glanced at the security monitor. The live feed showed the back garden. There, under a faint pool of light, Grace sat beside Ethan on a bench. She wasn't instructing him. She was simply sitting with him, letting him line up his toy cars while she read a worn paperback. It was such a simple human scene, but it struck Alexander like lightning. No expensive specialist had ever managed to make Ethan feel this safe. Why her? The next morning, he called the housekeeper into his office. "The new maid?" "Grace, who hired her?" "She came through the agency, sir. Temporary contract. I can have her replaced if she's causing disruption." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "Replaced? For comforting my son?" The housekeeper froze, realizing she'd misjudged his tone. "No, sir. I only meant—" "Enough," he interrupted calmly. She stays. That decision spread through the household like wildfire. Some staff grew resentful. Others watched Grace with cautious curiosity. Grace, unaware of the conversation, simply continued her work with quiet determination. A few days later, Grace received a call from her mother. Her face paled as she listened. David's condition had worsened, and the hospital demanded immediate payment for another round of treatment. Tears threatened to fall, but she held them back. She thanked her mother, hung up, and stared at the pay stub in her hand. It wasn't enough. Not nearly. That evening, exhausted from a double shift, she stood by the laundry room doorway, fighting the rising panic in her chest. Quitting wasn't an option. She had no one else to rely on. When Ethan appeared unexpectedly at the doorway, clutching one of his toy cars, she forced a smile. He looked at her quietly, then placed the car in her hand before walking away. It was a small gesture, but to Grace it felt like the universe whispering, "Keep going." Back in the main house, Alexander sat in his office again, staring at a framed picture of Ethan as a baby. His late wife's smile shone brightly in that photo. Since her passing, he'd buried himself in work, building walls higher than the mansion's gates. He told himself it was to protect Ethan, but deep down he knew it was to protect himself from pain. Watching Grace interact with his son cracked something open, a reminder of the warmth he'd shut out long ago. Unseen by each other, both Grace and Alexander lay awake that night, each at a crossroads. She wondered how much longer she could endure. He wondered how much longer he could keep ignoring what was happening in his own home. The storm was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The next morning, Grace arrived at the mansion earlier than usual. The sun hadn't fully risen. A golden line of light stretched across the estate's marble walls. She walked through the quiet halls, her heart heavy with the housekeeper's words echoing in her head. "Don't get too comfortable. You're not special." Grace had lived through hardship before. She knew whispers couldn't break her, but this time it wasn't just about her. It was about Ethan. She had seen something fragile yet beautiful in that boy. A silent world that few had the patience to understand. As she entered the playroom, Ethan was already awake, sitting in his usual corner, stacking blocks with meticulous focus. The other maids often avoided him this early, but Grace knelt beside him, her voice soft. "Good morning, Ethan," she said, careful not to overwhelm him. He didn't respond with words, but his hand paused mid-air. "A small sign." She smiled. "Look," she whispered, lifting a block and gently placing it on his tower. To her quiet joy, Ethan reached for another and handed it to her. A shared game began. No eye contact, no loud laughter, just a rhythm. Two souls speaking without words. Upstairs, Alexander stood by the balcony overlooking the playroom. He had been restless all night, replaying that hallway conversation in his mind. He didn't know why it affected him. Grace was just an employee, wasn't she? Yet there was something about her calm defiance that unsettled him. He watched her now, unnoticed, as she built towers with his son. Ethan hadn't let anyone get that close in months. Therapists had tried, teachers had failed. But this woman, this soft-spoken maid, had walked into his world without force. Alexander felt something unfamiliar tightening in his chest. Later that day, whispers spread again among the staff. "She's trying too hard," one maid muttered near the kitchen. "She wants the boss to notice her," another snickered. "She's just using that boy to climb the ladder." Grace overheard it all. She pretended to keep scrubbing dishes, but inside each word struck like a hidden blade. She didn't have the luxury to answer back. She needed this job. She needed to protect the little bridge she'd built with Ethan. Days turned into weeks, and Grace's presence began to change the atmosphere. Ethan smiled, faintly but real. He reached for her hand during walks in the garden. He hummed little tunes during breakfast. But with each new connection, the house grew colder toward her. The older staff felt threatened. One evening, after Grace tucked Ethan in, she found her uniform soaked in the laundry sink, ruined with bleach. Someone had done it deliberately. She held the fabric in her trembling hands, fighting back tears. Alexander happened to pass by at that moment. He froze, watching her silently. She didn't see him. She just pressed the ruined cloth to her chest and whispered, "You'll be okay, Grace. Don't break now. For the first time in years, Alexander felt something pierce through the wall around his heart. He wasn't just watching an employee. He was witnessing strength. Quiet, unyielding strength. The next day, during Ethan's therapy session, something happened that none of them expected. Ethan had a sudden sensory overload. Lights flickered, a tray clattered to the floor, and the boy collapsed into a ball, covering his ears and screaming. The therapist froze, unsure. Staff stepped back in panic, but Grace, she ran toward him. She turned off the lights, sat beside him on the floor, and began humming softly. The same melody she'd once sung to comfort her younger brother back home. Slowly, Ethan's cries weakened. He pressed his forehead to hers, and in that fragile moment, the room fell silent. From the doorway, Alexander watched. His jaw tightened. His eyes burned. He wasn't used to feeling this way, humbled. Moved, something deep inside him whispered, "Everything is changing." The house was quiet after the head housekeeper's sharp warning to Grace. She returned to her duties with her chin lowered, but the sting of those words clung to her like a shadow. She thought no one had seen, no one had heard. But in the corner of the hallway, Alexander stood still, his hand on the polished rail of the staircase, his expression unreadable. For years, the billionaire had lived behind walls taller than stone, but in that moment, something within him cracked. He didn't speak. He simply watched the way Grace lowered herself to Ethan's level, when his small hands trembled with frustration. Watched the way her voice never rose, though the boy's screams could rattle the chandeliers. Watched the way she protected him with patience that money could not buy. Later that evening, at dinner, Alexander sat across from his son at the endless mahogany table. Ethan pushed his plate away, frowning, shoulders tense. The other staff shifted nervously, waiting for the inevitable, the storm that always followed. But before Alexander could intervene, Grace's voice floated softly from behind Ethan. "Ethan," she said gently, "remember our game? One bite for strength, one bite for courage." The boy's lips twitched. He glanced at her, then at his untouched plate. Slowly, he picked up his fork. "One small bite, then another." Grace smiled. Not at Alexander, not at the staff, but only at the boy. And Alexander saw it. For the first time in years, his son ate without fear. A silence filled the dining room, different from the stiff silence of wealth. This one was warm, alive. Alexander felt it press against him, unsettling, unfamiliar. He cleared his throat, his voice deep but oddly softer than usual. "Thank you, Grace," he said. The staff froze. They weren't used to him acknowledging a maid, let alone one the housekeeper constantly belittled. Grace lowered her head humbly. "Just doing my job, sir." But Alexander knew it was more than that. The following days revealed subtle changes. When Ethan woke trembling from a nightmare, Grace was already at his bedside, humming an old lullaby her grandmother used to sing. When Ethan panicked at the sound of thunder, Grace held his hand, guiding him through deep breaths until the storm outside became a lesson in bravery rather than terror. And Alexander? He found himself lingering at doorways, his polished shoes silent against the marble, simply watching. One evening he interrupted. Ethan had hidden beneath the piano, curled into a ball after a guest's loud laughter startled him. Grace crouched down, her voice tender. "It's all right, sweetheart. The world can be loud, but you're safe. Can you hear my voice?" The boy whimpered. Alexander stepped forward. His presence filled the room, and normally Ethan would retreat further. But this time Alexander lowered himself too, awkwardly, ungracefully, his expensive suit creasing against the polished floor. "Ethan," his voice cracked just slightly. "Can you hear my voice?" The boy peeked from behind the piano leg. Grace's eyes widened. She had never seen Alexander kneel for anyone. Together they coaxed Ethan out, and when the boy finally crawled into Grace's arms, Alexander's gaze softened, not at his son alone, but at the woman who had somehow reached him where therapists, teachers, and even his father had failed. But with warmth came whispers. The staff noticed Alexander's subtle kindness. A nod here, a softened tone there. Some muttered that the maid was overstepping, that she was playing a dangerous game. The head housekeeper in particular fumed. "She is blurring lines," she hissed to another servant. "And he is letting her." The whispers reached Grace. She felt the weight of eyes on her back as she scrubbed the silver, as she folded linen, as she carried Ethan's drawings to his room. Doubt crept in. Was she truly helping? Or was she risking everything? One afternoon, as she carried a tray through the long corridor, Alexander appeared suddenly at the top of the staircase. His voice stopped her. "Grace," she turned, heart racing. He rarely addressed her directly. "Yes, sir?" He studied her for a moment. Then with surprising gentleness he said, "You've been good for him." "Better than most," Grace blinked. Compliments were rare in this house. Rarer still from Alexander himself. She dipped her head. "Thank you, sir. He's a remarkable boy. He just needs patience." Alexander's eyes lingered on her, searching. For what, even he didn't know. At last he nodded and walked away. But his words clung to her, not as a warning but as something dangerously close to approval. That night, Alexander couldn't sleep. He walked the darkened halls of his mansion, past portraits of ancestors whose stern gazes reminded him of duty, power, and wealth. Yet his mind returned to the image of his son, smiling, eating, breathing easier, all because of a maid who refused to treat him like a burden. For the first time in years, Alexander wondered if perhaps money wasn't the answer. The mansion was unusually still that afternoon. Outside, rain tapped gently against the tall glass windows, a soft rhythm that filled the otherwise empty corridors. Down in the grand hallway, Grace moved silently, her hands busy polishing the silver trays for the upcoming weekend gala. She hummed under her breath, an old tune from her childhood, the kind that calmed Ethan when he was overwhelmed. Her reflection shimmered in the silver. A woman who worked hard, who kept her head low, who tried to bring light to a house that often felt frozen. She didn't hear the footsteps at first. "Still pretending you belong here?" The voice was sharp, dripping with contempt. Grace froze for a second, then slowly turned. The head housekeeper stood a few steps away, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Behind her, two other maids lingered like shadows, their eyes narrowed, eager for drama. Grace swallowed. "I was just finishing these for the gala." "I didn't ask what you were doing," the housekeeper interrupted coldly. She stepped closer, her heels clicking against the marble. "I'm asking why you're doing it here, in the center of the house, like you own the place." Grace frowned softly. "I'm just doing my job." The housekeeper let out a low, humorless laugh. Your job is to stay out of the way. But lately," she glanced at the others with a knowing smirk, "it seems you've forgotten your place." The other maids chuckled under their breath. Grace lowered her eyes, trying to stay calm. "I haven't forgotten anything. I only focus on helping Ethan. And that," the housekeeper snapped, "is exactly the problem. You've gotten too close, acting like some kind of savior. Do you think the family actually sees you as one of them?" She leaned in, voice dropping to a cruel whisper. "You're replaceable, just like every maid before you." The words cut deeper than Grace wanted to admit. She gripped the edge of the tray, forcing her hands not to tremble. Unbeknownst to them, at the top of the staircase, Alexander had paused. He'd been on his way to his study when the voices below caught his attention. He stood still, hidden behind the banister, listening. The housekeeper circled Grace slowly, like a predator. "You've been parading around with that boy as if you're his mother. It's pitiful, really. You think a few lullabies make you special. He'll forget you the moment you're gone." Grace bit her lip, her heart pounding. She wanted to defend herself, to tell them that Ethan wasn't just a job to her. He was a child who needed love, patience, and kindness. But years of working under people like this had taught her that answering back only made it worse. She stayed silent. The housekeeper tilted her head mockingly. "No clever words now? Maybe you finally understand. People like us don't change families like his. We clean their floors, polish their silver, and then we disappear. Don't confuse kindness for belonging." At the top of the stairs, Alexander's jaw tightened. Grace straightened slowly, her voice soft but steady. "I never asked to belong. I just care about him." The housekeeper's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but then she sneered. "Then do yourself a favor, Grace, care from a distance, before you overstep and lose everything." Grace stood in the marble kitchen, her hands buried deep in soapy water, as she scrubbed dishes left behind after the Billionaire's elite luncheon. The laughter of guests still echoed faintly from the drawing room. She tried to stay invisible like always, but Mrs. Whitmore, the senior housekeeper with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, wouldn't let her. "You missed a spot. Look at that plate. Disgusting." Her voice sliced through the air. Grace turned, bowing her head slightly. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I'll clean it again," Mrs. Whitmore smirked. "You always say that. Maybe it's not the plate's fault. Maybe you don't belong here. People like you should stick to scrubbing floors in some dusty corner of the city. This house isn't for—" Grace's grip on the plate tightened. She kept her gaze low. She'd heard words like that all her life, but inside, each one still stung. She thought of her son, Daniel, and how she'd promised him this job would change everything. "Ma'am, I'll do better," she whispered. Forcing her voice to stay calm, Mrs. Whitmore leaned closer, lowering her tone. "You're lucky Mr. Alexander hasn't noticed you. The moment he does, you'll be out. Men like him don't keep your kind around long." Grace's chest tightened. She blinked rapidly, refusing to let tears win. Then a quiet sound broke the tension, the soft click of shoes on marble. Mrs. Whitmore froze. Alexander had entered silently, as he often did. His tall figure cast a long shadow across the kitchen floor. He wasn't in a tailored suit this time, just a plain white shirt, sleeves rolled up. But his presence still made the air shift. Neither woman had realized he'd been standing there long enough to hear. "Is this how we treat the people who keep this house running?" His voice was low, calm, but beneath it a steel edge. Mrs. Whitmore turned pale. "Sir, I was just—" "Enough!" Alexander cut in quietly. He didn't raise his voice when he didn't need to. His gaze alone made her shrink. Then he turned to Grace. For the first time, their eyes met properly. She expected anger, annoyance, but saw something else entirely. Confusion, realization, a flicker of guilt. "I heard everything," he said softly. "You're doing excellent work, Grace. If anyone here ever speaks to you like that again—" He glanced at Mrs. Whitmore, voice firm. "They won't be working here. Understood?" Mrs. Whitmore nodded, trembling. Grace stood frozen, heart pounding. She'd expected to be dismissed, not defended. As Alexander walked away, the kitchen felt different, quieter. Grace held onto the sink, tears slipping down her cheeks. Not from pain this time, but from something she hadn't felt in years. Respect. The kitchen emptied slowly after the confrontation. Mrs. Whitmore scurried off, her pride bruised, and the other staff kept their heads down, whispering nervously. Grace remained by the sink long after the dishes were done, hands still dipped in lukewarm water that had gone cloudy. Her shoulders trembled, not from exhaustion, but from the weight of emotions she'd locked away for years. She pressed a wet hand against her chest. No one had ever stood up for her like that. For so long, she had been the maid and the outsider, the woman with the accent. Her role was to clean quietly, blend into the background, never make ripples. But Alexander's words had rippled through her entire being, like a stone dropped into still water. She moved to the small back hallway, leaning against the cool wall tiles. Silent tears slipped down her cheeks. Not sobs, just quiet release. It wasn't sadness. It was the shock of being seen. She thought of her son, Daniel. She pictured his bright smile when she told him about this job. "Mama, maybe this means we'll finally have a home where you don't cry at night." She had promised him she'd be strong, but she hadn't expected strength to come from someone else's voice today. Upstairs, Alexander stood by the balcony railing, looking down into the courtyard. He held a cup of coffee untouched. His mind replayed what he'd heard in that kitchen. Not just the housekeeper's cruelty, but Grace's quiet response. She hadn't fought back. She hadn't tried to curry favor. She had simply stood there, humble, patient, holding in years of pain. He wasn't used to that. In his world, people either groveled or bit back. Grace had done neither. And when her eyes met his, there was no fear, just raw honesty. It unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite name. Through a crack between the curtains, he saw her step outside the back door, standing beneath the old sycamore tree. She tilted her head toward the night sky as if whispering a prayer. For a moment, Alexander simply watched. Not as a billionaire, not as an employer, but as a man trying to understand something unfamiliar. He noticed the way she wiped her face quickly when another maid passed by, pretending she hadn't been crying. The way she straightened her uniform before re-entering the house. Dignity stitched into every motion. Something in his chest stirred. A faint pull he hadn't felt since his late wife passed. He turned away abruptly, as if catching himself thinking too much. But the image of Grace standing alone beneath the stars stayed with him. And deep down, he knew. This wasn't going to be the last time she'd make him pause. The garden was bathed in late afternoon light, golden beams slipping through the tall hedges and casting long, warm shadows across the manicured lawn. The scent of fresh grass mixed with the faint perfume of blooming jasmine. Grace stepped cautiously along the cobblestone path, her hands folded in front of her, heart thudding as she spotted Ethan sitting under the shade of the old oak tree. He hadn't noticed her yet. His small fingers traced patterns on the ground, lines in the dirt, as though drawing a map only he could understand. His shoulders were hunched, head bowed, and when the wind stirred the leaves, he flinched. Grace crouched a few feet away, careful not to startle him. She kept her voice soft, almost a whisper. "Hi, Ethan," she said gently. He didn't look up. He didn't move. She inhaled, steadying herself. "I brought something you might like." From her apron pocket, she produced a small wooden block, a bright red one, smooth and polished. She placed it on the ground near him and stepped back. Ethan's hand twitched. He glanced at it but quickly looked away. Grace waited, her heart in her throat. She knew patience was everything. No rush, no pressure. Just time. Minutes passed. The only sounds were the rustle of leaves, a distant bird, and Ethan's quiet humming, a rhythm he used when he felt anxious. Grace hummed along softly, not loud, just matching his pitch, letting him know she was there. Gradually, he inched his hand closer to the block, eyes darting to Grace for a fraction of a second before retreating again. She smiled faintly. "Good job noticing it. It's yours if you want it." Still he hesitated. Grace remained still, letting the silence carry the invitation. Finally, with a tiny trembling motion, he reached out and touched the block. His fingers met hers briefly, a hesitant bridge between two worlds. A small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Grace mirrored it gently. "See? We can build things together." The first block was laid, then another. And another. The tower grew slowly, wobbly at first, but steady, and with every block, Ethan's shoulders relaxed, the line between anxiety and comfort blurring just slightly. Above, Alexander stood on the balcony, leaning lightly against the railing. He had followed her footsteps silently, curious, unsure. Watching the interaction made something ache in his chest. He had never seen his son look so peaceful. He had never seen anyone calm him like this, and yet Grace never forced it. She let Ethan take the lead, letting his small victories shape the rhythm of the game. After some time, Ethan looked directly at Grace, a fleeting, trusting glance. He said a word, soft and small, barely audible. "Block." Grace's eyes welled up. It was the first real word she had heard him say in weeks. "Yes, Ethan," she said gently, placing the block carefully in the tower. "We're doing it together." He laughed softly, a sound so rare it felt like music. Alexander's hand gripped the railing tightly. He felt a wave of gratitude and something unfamiliar, humility. The tower eventually toppled, scattering blocks across the grass. Ethan didn't cry. He didn't panic. He looked at Grace. "Again?" he asked. Grace nodded, smiling. "Again." And so they started rebuilding, together. From above, Alexander watched silently. The world he had meticulously controlled, the house he had ruled with order and authority, felt suddenly smaller, fragile, and human. He realized in that moment that something profound had shifted. This woman, this quiet, steadfast maid, had touched his son in a way he never could. The garden was no longer just a place of beauty. It had become a sanctuary, a place of trust, of courage, and a small miracle. And for Alexander, it was the first time in years that he understood that wealth and power were meaningless without kindness. The evening was heavy with tension, yet quiet in the grand mansion. Golden lamplight pooled on the polished floors, reflecting shadows that seemed to twist like secrets in the corners. Alexander had barely slept, haunted by the image of Grace and Ethan in the garden. The small tower of blocks, the hesitant smile, the laughter that seemed impossibly fragile, yet achingly real. He wandered through the halls, lost in thought until he reached the library. The familiar scent of old leather and polished wood usually soothed him. Tonight it only deepened his unease. His mind replayed the head housekeeper's cruelty, the whispered warnings from staff, and the silent courage of Grace. He didn't hear the soft creak behind the large double doors at first. Alexander? A quiet, trembling voice, one he had not expected. He turned sharply. There, half hidden by the shadows, was a woman he had never met before. A long-time assistant of his late wife, someone the staff rarely mentioned. Her hands clutched a stack of letters, her face pale and lined with worry. "What is this?" he asked, trying to steady his voice. They're from before your wife passed," she said, stepping closer. "You need to see them." He took the letters, feeling the paper tremble under his fingers. Slowly, he unfolded the topmost one. The handwriting was unmistakable, soft, deliberate, filled with the kind of warmth he had long forgotten. The letters spoke of a secret plan, a hidden wish, that Ethan, his son, should never feel unloved or abandoned. That his caregivers should be more than staff. They should be companions, guides, and protectors. That whoever earned the boy's trust would be treasured above all else. Alexander's pulse quickened. He read on, realizing for the first time the depth of his wife's foresight. The woman's words were clear. "If anyone reaches Ethan's heart the way he needs, treat them not as servants but as part of this family. Their loyalty is worth more than gold." His mind raced back to Grace, the way she had held Ethan, the way she had never faltered in the face of cruelty, the way she had earned the boy's trust without asking for anything in return. A slow, shocking realization took root. Grace wasn't just good at her job. She had fulfilled the very wishes of the woman he loved and lost. She had done it without asking for recognition. She had done it purely out of love for Ethan. Alexander set the letters down, his hands shaking. Every memory of strict orders, every instruction he had given his staff, every ounce of control he had wielded suddenly felt hollow. He understood something he hadn't allowed himself to. Grace had been the answer all along. Not wealth, not tutors, not therapists. She had reached Ethan in a way no one else could. A noise from the hallway made him glance up. Through the cracked door, he could see her quietly leaving Ethan's room, her expression calm but weary. She hadn't noticed him. His chest tightened. For years, he had measured people by obedience, efficiency, loyalty. But here in this mansion, in this quiet library, he understood that some qualities were immeasurable. Patience, empathy, courage, kindness. Suddenly, the assistant spoke again. Softly, "She's the one, Alexander. She's the person your wife wanted by your son's side." He swallowed hard. The truth hit like a physical force. Everything he had believed about power, control, and hierarchy shifted in an instant. It wasn't just that Grace had comforted his son. It was that she had done the impossible. She had become indispensable in a way money could never buy. Alexander knew in that moment that the world would never be the same. Not for him, not for Ethan, and certainly not for Grace. The next morning, the mansion seemed quieter, almost fragile, as if it sensed the shift in Alexander's mind. He had barely slept, running every detail of the letters through his thoughts. But his curiosity was insatiable. He needed to know more. Grace was already in the garden, tending to the small flower beds near the fountain. Ethan sat nearby, arranging pebbles in intricate patterns along the stone path. He didn't look up when she approached, yet the subtle twitch of his hand betrayed his awareness. Alexander lingered behind the tall hedges, watching silently. He remembered the previous evening, the letters, the soft voice of the late assistant, the realization that Grace had been fulfilling his wife's secret wishes all along. And now, as he observed Grace, he noticed how naturally she adapted to every movement, every shift in Ethan's mood, without a single command or reprimand. Her hands gently guided his when he fumbled with the pebbles. Her voice never rose above a whisper, yet it carried an authority that Ethan obeyed without fear. Alexander's chest tightened as he watched a small smile bloom on Ethan's face. This tiny, miraculous moment was the culmination of months of care, patience, and unwavering empathy. And it had been invisible to everyone else, until now. Later that day, Alexander summoned the head housekeeper to the study. She entered with a rigid posture, expecting rebuke or praise for some trivial housekeeping detail. Instead, Alexander's gaze met hers, calm but piercing. "I've learned a lot in the last 24 hours," he began. "About loyalty, about patience, about courage, about what truly matters in this house." Her eyes narrowed. "Sir," he held up the letters. "These contain instructions from someone whose judgment I respect more than my own. Someone who loved this family unconditionally." Her lips pressed together. A flicker of fear crossed her face. "I've observed Grace," he continued, "and I've watched how she has earned my son's trust, how she has cared for him when none of us could, and I've decided that any attempt to undermine her will no longer be tolerated." The head housekeeper's color drained. Alexander's voice, calm as it was, left no room for argument. Meanwhile, in the garden, Grace noticed Alexander's shadow lingering near the fountain. She froze, unsure if he had seen her and Ethan. He stepped forward slowly, hands folded. "Grace," he said quietly, "I've seen everything." Grace blinked, swallowing the nervous lump in her throat. "Sir, He held up a hand. "No explanations. I only want to say thank you for everything, for him, for being patient, for never giving up." Her chest tightened. She wanted to speak, but tears threatened to spill. Ethan tugged gently at her sleeve, looking between them. Alexander crouched slightly, keeping his distance, letting Ethan take the lead. "It's okay, son," he said softly. "You choose." Ethan placed his small hand in Grace's and nodded. The gesture was simple, yet in that moment, it carried more weight than any word. Alexander felt something stir deep within him. Humility, gratitude, and a recognition that power meant little without love. Over the following days, Alexander began quietly observing the mansion in a new light. Staff who once whispered criticisms of Grace now avoided confrontations. Any attempt at cruelty was met with his calm, quiet authority, the kind that didn't shout but carried an unyielding weight. Grace and Ethan's bond continued to deepen. She introduced small games, gentle routines, and patient lessons. He responded in kind, gradually opening up, laughing more, trusting more. Alexander watched it all, silently noting the transformation not just in his son, but in himself. And then came the final revelation. A letter hidden behind the desk in the study, written years ago by his late wife, revealed that Grace had once been close to the family in an unexpected way. She had been a distant cousin, someone the wife had trusted implicitly with Ethan's well-being. The letter instructed Alexander to allow her influence to grow, to let her guide his son with freedom. Alexander's hand shook as he read. Every hesitation he had held vanished. Grace's patience, courage, and devotion were not accidents. They were part of a plan set in motion long before he could even recognize their significance. He realized fully, Grace was more than a maid. She was the guardian his son needed, the heart that kept the family whole, and the person who had quietly changed everything in ways money and power never could. The mansion awoke the next morning with a rare serenity. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, scattering across the polished floors, and the scent of freshly cut roses from the garden filled every corridor. Even the head housekeeper moved with a hesitant grace, her earlier arrogance tempered by the subtle but undeniable change in Alexander's demeanor. Alexander walked through the halls, silent, yet each step seemed deliberate, weighted with thought. He paused outside Ethan's room, listening to the quiet sound of laughter and soft humming. The boy was playing with Grace, building intricate towers from colored blocks, occasionally peeking at Alexander from the corner of his eye. The connection between them was tangible, a fragile yet vibrant thread weaving trust and love. He inhaled deeply, letting himself savor the scene. For years he had measured success in wealth, in control, in precision. But now, watching Grace patiently guiding his son's small hands, adjusting a block when Ethan's fingers trembled, he realized that success had always been measured wrong. True triumph was quiet, invisible, and sometimes it came in the form of someone who loved without expecting anything in return. Later, in the dining hall, Alexander called a private meeting of the senior staff. The tension was palpable, the air thick with anticipation and fear. "Grace is staying," Alexander announced calmly, his gaze sweeping the room. "And anyone who cannot respect her or who undermines her in any way will not remain in this household." The head housekeeper's face paled, and the others exchanged nervous glances. The mansion had long been a place of hierarchy and whispered politics, but Alexander's quiet authority left no room for argument. Grace entered quietly, standing just behind Ethan, who clung gently to her hand. She felt the weight of every gaze but held herself steady, her calm demeanor reflecting the strength she had cultivated over months of adversity. Alexander gestured toward Ethan. "Your son has chosen her, and that choice is final. No one here is above the child's trust, not even me. Everyone has a role. Everyone has a responsibility. But kindness, patience, and empathy are non-negotiable." The words hung in the room like a solemn decree. In the garden that afternoon, the transformation of the household became even more apparent. Staff who had once whispered criticisms now assisted quietly, respectfully allowing Grace and Ethan to explore the sandbox, the pebble paths, and the small fountain together. Alexander watched from the balcony above, a gentle smile tugging at his lips. He had spent decades mastering the art of control, yet he understood with clarity and humility that some things could not be controlled. Some things, like love, trust, and courage, had to be nurtured, observed, and respected. Ethan's laughter rang across the garden, pure and unrestrained, and Grace matched it with her soft, melodic giggle. Alexander felt the tight knot in his chest ease. The boy who had been guarded, anxious, and hesitant was now vibrant, alive, and happy. Days turned into weeks. Grace continued to care for Ethan with unwavering dedication. She introduced small routines, gentle walks in the garden, storytelling sessions, and playful building projects. Each activity strengthened their bond, gradually transforming the mansion from a place of quiet tension to a sanctuary of warmth. Alexander, too, changed. He spent more time observing, learning, and supporting rather than commanding. He took up the small task of helping Ethan with his blocks, his voice patient, gentle, a sound he had rarely heard himself use. And in those moments he felt a profound connection not just with his son, but with Grace, a connection rooted in trust, respect, and shared purpose. The head housekeeper, once haughty and critical, now moved with subdued humility. She offered assistance quietly when needed, no longer attempting to dominate or belittle. It was as though the invisible hand of fairness had swept through the mansion, leaving balance and respect in its wake one evening. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber and violet, Alexander approached Grace and Ethan in the garden. "Shall we build one last tower for today?" he asked, kneeling beside them. Ethan's eyes lit up. "Yes," he exclaimed, handing a block to Grace, then Alexander. As they worked together, carefully balancing each piece, Alexander felt a wave of gratitude. He looked at Grace, her gentle focus on his son, her unwavering patience, and he realized how profoundly she had changed their lives. Not with wealth, not with power, but with the quiet courage of a kind heart. The tower stood tall, wobbling slightly, yet strong, a reflection of the fragile yet enduring trust that now united them all. By the time night fell, the mansion was alive with warmth and soft laughter. Alexander tucked Ethan into bed, whispering a promise to always respect his choices, to always protect his happiness. Grace lingered, smiling softly, her presence a constant source of calm and comfort. The mansion had been transformed, not by rules, not by authority, not by wealth, but by empathy, courage, and the quiet power of love. For the first time in years, Alexander felt peace. And as he watched Grace leave the room, the faintest smile on her face, he knew everything had truly changed. The following days in the mansion felt lighter, as if a burden had finally lifted. The morning sun poured into every room, and for the first time in years, the halls echoed not with tension or whispers, but with gentle laughter and the soft rhythm of life unfolding naturally. Alexander spent his mornings walking through the corridors, greeting staff with genuine warmth. Gone were the days of curt commands or impatient corrections. He spoke quietly, calmly, and with an attentiveness that surprised even himself. Every glance he cast toward Grace was tinged with gratitude for her patience, her courage, and the unwavering care she had given Ethan. In the garden, Ethan thrived. He built towers of blocks, traced patterns in the dirt, and laughed freely when Grace gently corrected him or guided his tiny hands. The boy's world, once fraught with uncertainty and hesitation, was now filled with trust and joy. Each time his small hand rested in hers, Grace felt the bond solidify, a quiet miracle born of patience, empathy, and love. Alexander often lingered on the balcony, watching silently, but he no longer felt the need to intervene. He understood that Grace's influence was perfect as it was, quiet, natural, transformative. The staff had also taken notice. Those who once whispered or undermined her now moved with a newfound respect, offering assistance only when needed, and never questioning her guidance with Ethan. One afternoon, as a gentle breeze rustled the leaves in the garden, Alexander approached Grace. Ethan was focused intently on balancing his blocks, unaware of the presence looming above him. "Grace," Alexander said softly, kneeling beside her. "Thank you. Not just for today or for last week, but for everything you've done for him, for this family, for changing the life of a boy who deserved love more than anything." Grace shook her head, eyes glistening. "I didn't do it for you or for anyone else. I did it for Ethan. He needed someone to believe in him, and I wanted to be that person." Alexander's chest tightened. "You've done more than anyone could have imagined. More than I could have imagined." He paused, watching Ethan's tiny hands adjust a precarious block. "I've been so focused on control, on efficiency, on order, and I forgot what really matters. You reminded me." Ethan suddenly looked up, giggling as his tower wobbled dangerously. Grace caught his small hand just in time, steadying the top block. Alexander felt a wave of emotion wash over him. In that moment, he saw the boy's trust in Grace, unshakable and pure. "Can we build it again?" Ethan asked, his voice bright and eager. Grace smiled warmly. "Of course we can." Alexander nodded silently, observing the two of them as they continued. The sunlight bathed them in golden warmth, and for the first time, the mansion felt alive, not with wealth or authority, but with care, patience, and love. Evening fell, and the mansion's staff gathered quietly in the hall, led by Alexander. He addressed them with calm authority. "This household will be governed by respect, kindness, and empathy," he said. "Everyone has a role. Everyone has a responsibility. But above all, you will honor those who care for the ones who cannot always speak for themselves. Grace has proven that courage and patience are the strongest forces here. Never forget that." Heads nodded, whispers of agreement rippling through the room. The once haughty housekeeper lowered her eyes, humbled, while others offered quiet smiles of understanding. The balance had shifted. That night, Alexander walked through the mansion one last time before retiring. He peeked into Ethan's room and saw Grace tucking him in, reading softly from a storybook, her voice gentle and melodic. Ethan rested his head on the pillow, eyes heavy with sleep. Clutching Grace's hand tightly, Alexander felt an unfamiliar warmth in his chest. Gratitude, humility, peace. As he left the room, he paused in the doorway, observing the quiet miracle unfolding. The boy who had once been withdrawn and anxious was now alive with joy and trust. The maid who had once been overlooked and underestimated had become the heart of the household. And the billionaire, once consumed by control and power, had learned the immeasurable value of kindness and empathy. The mansion was no longer a house of hierarchy and fear. It was a home alive with love, respect, and understanding. And for Alexander, Grace, and Ethan, life would never be the same again. In the quiet of the evening, as the mansion lay bathed in soft lamplight, Alexander reflected on everything that had happened. He realized that true power is not measured by wealth, status, or authority. It is measured by kindness, patience, and the courage to stand for what is right. Grace, with her quiet strength and unwavering empathy, had shown him that love and understanding can bridge gaps that money and influence never could. She had reached Ethan's heart not by force or reward, but by listening, observing, and caring in ways that were patient and pure. She had taught him that the simplest acts, a gentle word, a small gesture of support, a hand held in trust, can transform lives. Ethan's laughter, his growing confidence, and his willingness to trust again were the living proof of Grace's courage and dedication. And Alexander, once a man consumed by control, had learned that the most important role of a parent and a leader is to nurture, respect, and protect the hearts of those who depend on you. This story is a reminder that real change begins with empathy, that courage is not always loud, and strength is not always measured in power. Sometimes the quietest hearts make the loudest difference. If this story touched your heart, remember to carry its lesson into your own life. Look for opportunities to show patience, kindness, and understanding. Sometimes a small act of care can change someone's world forever.